Welcome back to Bunny Trails, everyone. This is Dan. Shauna is on vacation, but this week we have a retro episode for you, and we recorded it on location in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, back in the summer of 2019. Clearly, we recorded the first thing in the morning because my voice was much deeper than usual. You may notice in the show we did things a little differently in our earlier days. One change we made was to be completely clear about what we were quoting. So now you hear us say things like quote and end quote in our shows. But back in 2019, we were less clear. Another note, we mentioned a cool, funny history podcast at the end of the show, Cutting Class with Jess and Joe. That podcast ended its run in August of 2022, but you can still listen to their 177 episodes on Spotify. Before we jump into the episode, we need to give a special thanks to our patrons, especially Pat Rowe and our Dean of Learning, Mary Halstig Lopez. Without you all of our patrons, we would not be able to make the show. Our Patreon is free to join, but we also have several tiers where you can help support the show and get some pretty cool perks too. You can join the community on Patreon at patreon.com/bunnytrailspod. And with that, we're going to jump into episode 57, Acknowledge the Corn and Other American Civil War Slang, originally released August 7th, 2019.
Welcome to Bunny Trails, a whimsical adventure of idioms and other turns of phrase. I'm Shauna Harrison.
And I'm Dan Pugh. Usually, we delve into the origin and history of one specific idiom or other turn of phrase, and discuss how it's been used over time. But occasionally, we like to take a group of phrases that doesn't have enough information for a one show, but we give you a little bit of background about each of them. We usually do this through a theme, including our past themes like weddings and theaters. This week, we're coming to you on location from the beautiful borough of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to talk about American Civil War slang. The audio quality of this episode, just be forewarned, might be a little different. We're sitting in a Civil War era house, and the street is very close, unlike our usual recording studio, and so you will hear some background noise from time to time.
Maybe even a few tours or something like that going by. So it was like 1860s. They weren't real worried about recording acoustic quality, so,
Yeah, no, that's fair.
It wasn't a priority.
The Battle of Gettysburg was fought July 1st through 3rd, 1863, in and around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and this was by the Union and the Confederate forces during the American Civil War. The battle involved the largest number of casualties of the entire war and is often described as the war's turning point. Basically, it's the bloodiest battle of the bloodiest war in American history.
It's crazy. It's a really intense experience to be here and see some of this stuff firsthand.
Yeah, it absolutely has been. But enough downers. Let's jump right into the phrases. So the first one I'm going to use is come the gum game. And this is a phrase that I've never heard before.
Me
I think
either.
it has completely fallen out of favor now. During the Civil War, Private James Snell wrote in his diary, "The rebels tried to come a gum game on us." The next entry indicates that the Confederates were trying to make Snell's regiment believe that they were retreating when they were not. This is by a paper from J. Monaghan called Civil War Slang and Humor. Monaghan notes that this is one of the many idioms used by soldiers in the Civil War, which is completely evaporated from modern speech.
Crazy.
The Oxford English Dictionary defines gum game or come the gum game as a slang or a trick or a dodge. And we see this oftentimes with phrases in any case that the general public uses the phrase one way and soldiers use it in a slightly different way,
Yes.
especially during war. And we'll see a couple more examples of that as well. But here, it's still kind of the same thing, a trick or a dodge. But for soldiers, they used it specifically when someone was intentionally trying to pull the wool over their eyes, so to speak.
Gotcha. So almost more like a strategy type comment.
Right. Whereas in the general population, there didn't have to be malicious intent for it to be used.
Gotcha.
The first time we saw it was in 1840, so it was a relatively newer phrase that we'd heard. And when someone used the phrase, and specifically, "I've come the gum game over you" in a speech. We also see it in several other examples throughout the Civil War time frame. We see it in the Idaho World in the May 26th, 1866 edition. This is out of Idaho City, Idaho. That was a territory, not a state at that point. Where it says, a speck of nose like a wart, head as bald as a squash, and no place to hitch a waterfall. A mouth just suited to come the gum game and chew milk. Oh dear, you should hear her sing.
Oh.
So they're talking about a person who has a velvety voice, but is also well suited to get you to go along and to trick you and to get you to be very manipulative or influential, whichever way the person wanted to go.
Interesting.
In 1871, Edward Eggleston, the Hoosier schoolmaster, wrote, "Now looky here, you don't come no gum games over me."
Ah, nice.
And we see it in the Libsyn Star, which is out of the Dakota Territory, September 18th, 1885, where they said, "They tried to come the gum game on me down in Pennsylvania, but I came out ahead."
Nice.
I don't believe there was much love lost between territories in the West that were not a part of the United States at the time and duplicitous efforts of Americans, which has sort of been our calling card for the entirety of the existence of the nation.
Yeah.
So in the Dallas Daily Herald, November 20th, 1886, he got it, and the two skinned out. The grocer sat down in a tub of onions to think it over, and when he became satisfied that it was a gum game to beat him, and that the two men were Confederates, he rose up and kicked a dozen washboards sky high and marked the price of strawberries up 4 cents per quart.
Well, there you go.
So in this case, he got played and then got frustrated about it once he realized it. Now, the phrase seems to have fallen out of favor in the early 1900s, with one of the last instances I could find in print coming in January 1910. This is January 8th out of the Colville Examiner, which is Colville, Washington. "Isn't it some kind of gum game to get money out of you?" "Gum game? Gum game on me? Bowser?" And Bowser was the one talking, asking if this was some kind of a gum game, and the other one was incredulous that someone could trick them in any way.
Gotcha.
All right, so the next phrase I want to talk about is acknowledge the corn. And this is this was used during the Civil War and is a really fascinating phrase. It means to confess or acknowledge a charge, imputation, or failure. Sometimes we see it acknowledge the corn, sometimes we see it admit the corn, sometimes we see it confess the corn.
Okay.
This is a rocky beginning story, but the best that we have is from a newspaper where they were recounting the likely origin story of this.
Okay.
This phrase is said to have originated in Congress, and this, according to a story in the Pascagoula Democrat Star out of Mississippi, dated November 3rd, 1882. It is said to have originated in 1828 during a session of Congress. Okay. So Andrew Stewart, which is a congressman from Pennsylvania, claimed Kentucky and several other states were sending their haystacks, cornfields, and fodder to his state. The congressman from Kentucky, Charles Wycliffe, took issue with this and said they don't send those things. So when somebody asked what they did send, he said, "We send hogs and we send animals." And a typical congressional conversation ensued where they were back and forth about different things. And where Wycliffe admitted that the hogs are fed about 30 bushels of corn each to fatten them up.
Okay.
Which then, as Congress is much to this day, it's a showmanship and brinksmanship thing, not about actually getting anything done. Mm-hmm. So at that point, he says, then you put those 30 bushels into the shape of a hog and make it walk off the eastern market. So at this point, the Kentucky congressman realized he didn't want to keep arguing anymore, and he says, "Mr. Speaker, I acknowledge the corn." So since then, acknowledge the corn and later confess the corn has meant admitting to a lie or being caught in a falsehood. I will say I looked up to verify who all these people were and that they were actually in Congress at the time, and they were. I mean, So there's validity. These were all the actual people from Congress that were talking at the time. So
nice.
The origin was 1828, according to that story. In 1839, we see it out of the Daily Picayune in New Orleans. "We were certain it was not Dutch, and was in error saying it was Scotch, and we acknowledged the corn." We see it again just a year later, 1840, in the Daily Pennant out of St. Louis, July 14th issue. "David Johnson acknowledged the corn and said that he was drunk." I've never acknowledged the corn about being drunk, but can you imagine trying to say the word acknowledge while you were drunk? Like if you were in the moment acknowledging it, I acknowledge that there's a corn.
Like the corn. And they're all like, okay, yeah.
Yeah, we get it. Yeah, you're drunk. We know. In 1842, in the spirit of times out of Philadelphia, March 16th, Your Honor, I confess the corn. I was royally drunk. Are we seeing a pattern here?
I'm noticing this.
We do see it occasionally used to admit that someone was drunk, but they're saying, I was lying to you. I was drunk. Not, you couldn't just you couldn't just confess the corn and then they would know you meant you were drunk.
Gotcha.
And then 1846, out of the New York Herald, June 27th, the Evening Mirror very naively comes out and acknowledges the corn. Which I love that because I do that. The older I get, the more I look at a mirror and I'm like, ugh, who's that old guy?
That's funny.
The Weekly Comment out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and this is July 23rd, 1884. So many things have been done of late to entitle us to metropolitan notoriety that it is high time our contemporaries should acknowledge the corn. Have we not a very spacious city hall of sufficient dimensions to contain the number one engine? This is a frustration here where we're trying to use tax dollars to build a thing for a fire brigade. And the author is unhappy in this editorial for that. The Daily Dispatch, 1865, March 28th. This is out of Richmond, Virginia. There's no use in blazing up and calling him names and threatening blood and thunder. We may as well confess the corn. The old gentleman has been too smart for us, and we are mere children in his hands. Wonder what he would charge us to take us back to his family and educate us until we arrive at years of discretion.
Man.
I like this because threatening blood and thunder is a phrase that I want to look more into but haven't yet.
I really like that.
So, it's very fun to see how many idioms and phrases like that are used in print, So in this case, we have threatening blood and thunder, blazing up, which of course is not what that means these days. And then confess the corn, all in just like two sentences. Yeah. From a company that deals in ice distribution, which was a huge concept in the late 1800s before we had freezers and such. This is the Grand Rapids Herald out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, 1892, July 2nd. This is an advertisement for the A.B. Knowlson Company. We do sleep, yes we do, but it is in the witching hour of night. How exhaustive it must be to never sleep. One must naturally get very tired. We must acknowledge the corn, but nevertheless, we want your ice trade, your coal trade, also lime, cement, and other things.
Nice.
Yeah. So obviously at some point they'd used an advertisement campaign saying that we never sleep. So now they're kind of turning that and use the phrase the witching hour, which I love. And,
yeah, I like that.
Saying that we acknowledge the corn. We do sleep, but it's when you're asleep too, so it's no big deal. And then out of the Daybook, which is Chicago, Illinois, October 3rd, 1916. But why do teachers ask such questions? Why not eliminate all prejudices and acknowledge the corn, even if you're wrong? So this was a person who was talking about those that are teaching and are not showing. Basically, they're accusing them of being pro-German or pro-immigrant because even back then, teachers were still the bastion for equality and fighting for no, we should treat all of our students the same. Yeah. And of course, when you have privilege, any sort of equality can look like discrimination against you, or you feel like it is anyway.
Yeah.
So in this case, many of the white people in the community were very frustrated that the teachers were treating the immigrants the same, and there were German immigrants in the area, so they were saying they were pro-German, and anti-American in this case. So they're just saying, well, why don't they just admit that they're wrong? So that's because they're not wrong. That's why they're not going to do that, you racist.
That's so funny. My family part of my family arrived here in the United States from Germany.
I was going to say
around
in
this
Gettysburg?
time,
What?
actually. Well, I was not far. But yeah, over the ocean in a boat, that whole gig. But, nobody looks at me and calls me German these days.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. That's a whole nother story that we could talk about, but it's a bit of a bummer, so we won't.
Okay, fair enough.
So this phrase seems to have fallen out of favor in the late 19-teens, with only a few examples in the 1920s, and most of those being advertising puns, and they're directed at an older audience. Like this one in 1925 from the Evening Star out of Washington, D.C., that it was She hated to acknowledge the corn. So goes the old saying, and few indeed like to confess a corn. And this is a advertisement for a cream that you put on corns on the feet.
Oh, ew.
Yes. So it's specific. It's looking at a slightly older audience and using a phrase that the older audience would understand, but maybe the younger people wouldn't get. But that's all right. They're not trying to sell to the younger people.
Fair enough. Today's show is sponsored by our patrons. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, since the 1300s, the word patron has meant a person standing in a role of oversight, protection, or sponsorship to another. Patron comes from the Latin word for father, pater, then becoming patronus, meaning champion or protector, then to patron, meaning one who sponsors something, like a patron of the arts. Leonardo da Vinci had patrons like Medici and Cesare Borgia. Bunny Trails has similarly awesome patrons, including Charlie Moore, Pat Rowe, and Mary Lopez. We'd also like to thank our newest patron, Ernest Olson. If you want to become a patron of Bunny Trails and get cool perks like early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes content, monthly mini-episodes, and more, you can visit us at patreon.com/bunnytrailspod, or you can find links to it at bunnytrailspod.com.
So the next phrase I want to talk about is to see the elephant. This refers to gaining experience of the world, oftentimes at significant cost.
Gotcha. I thought maybe it was like some sort of rejoinder to like the elephant in the room or,
No, but they did come out of common root experiences.
Oh, cool.
So this phrase has been used as see the lion since the 1600s.
Oh, yeah.
Like this example from Captain John Smith in The True Travels, Adventures, and Observations of Captain J. Smith, 1630. After one Master John Bull with divers of his friends, we went to see the lions. In this case, they're talking about the lions in the Tower of London because people kept lions there. So you went to go see the lions and have that specific experience. To see the elephant seems to come into popular use in the 1800s. The Oxford English Dictionary has the first attestation in 1835 by Augustus Baldwin Longstreet in Georgia Scenes, Characters, Incidents, and etc. in the first half of the Republic by a native Georgian.
Okay.
Right. Augustus is obviously not following the rule of thumb that we have now set and should be retroactively applied to all books of the 1800s, that you can have a long name or a long title, but my goodness, you can't have both.
Yeah, what are you doing, Augustus?
In his book, he writes, "That's sufficient, as Tom Haynes said when he saw the elephant. In this case, and many outside of the war, see the elephant was to see life, the world, or the sights as of a large city, or to get the experience of life, or to gain knowledge by experience."
Gotcha.
So in 1857 work by Orlando White in Quinlan, or Varieties in American Life, "The fox and crow is one of the most famous sights in New York. It is never missed by the countryman or the foreigner who is searching after the elephant."
Ah, cool.
As early as the Mexican-American War, see the elephant was specifically used to mean to see battle among soldiers and military members. This was a common phrase during the Civil War as well, continuing at least until the Vietnam War, as Tom Dozzell wrote in Vietnam War Slang, a dictionary on historical principles. He has an entry that says, elephant, combat, usually in the phrase seen the elephant, meaning to have experienced combat.
Okay.
And this makes sense from an intuitive standpoint. See the elephant is about gaining life experiences, and when you are in a war, the biggest experience is going to combat. Especially wars like, the Civil War and Vietnam and World Wars I and II, when a large portion of the people fighting in those wars, that they did not sign up for that. Like that was not their. They might have been part of the militia, but they weren't looking at the military as a career path or something. They were drafted or forced into it because of what, in the case of the Civil War, an invasion of the homeland, or World War I or II, where we had to do something, right?
Yeah, well, and definitely a lot of them, like the Civil War, at least I noticed a lot of them signed up to avoid being the draft or things like that, because they continued to give extra benefits if you signed up on your own.
Right. Yeah. Well, I would argue that whether you were enlisted to avoid the draft or you were drafted, you were still coerced into it.
Yeah,
and while that's not necessarily a bad thing, I don't mean to
Yeah.
imply that fighting for your country and for people's rights is a bad thing. I'm very happy that people are willing to do that.
Absolutely.
But I would say it's disingenuous to say that if your draft number was 5 and so you went ahead and enlisted, that was anything but a coerced move. That was I've now seen what this looks like, and I guess of these options, this is what I'm doing. They paid during the Civil War. They paid bounties, is what they called it, to get people to sign up. So they basically what we would call now a signing bonus. They called it bounty. There's even a Civil War movie actually called Seeing the Elephant, an American Civil War movie. Seeing the Elephant, an indie film feature, is the centerpiece of the popular Wisconsin tourist attraction, the Fiery Trial Exhibit, which runs daily at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha. A term that soldiers use to describe active duty, Seeing the Elephant manipulates the senses and delivers its experience in the round, historically close up. The newest permanent addition to the Fiery Trial Exhibit, Seeing the Elephant, is an exceptional presentation and a Wisconsin attraction that is not to be missed.
That sounds pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, if I ever make my way to Kenosha, Wisconsin, I'll definitely check out the Civil War Museum there.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of the war, though, the phrase continues to be used in the general life experience way. In the weekly roundabout, which was out of Frankfort, Kentucky, April 17th, 1880. Logan McKee went to Louisville Tuesday morning to see the elephant. He saw it and says it was a big one. He got home later part of the week. This is a perfect example of our
Logan.
This is a perfect example of our natural need to share. This is a piece from a whole page of status updates posted in the newspaper. So I just want people to remember this. Whenever we talk about social media is just our current form of sharing. We used to do that in so many ways. And looking through old newspapers tells me 2 things about current society that is no different than past society. 1, we're bitterly rude and disgusting in our politics in this country since the beginning of this country. And 2, social media is not changing much. We literally have communicated by posting inane and banal things for the entirety of our written existence. We just did it in newspapers before, and now we do it, then we did it on chat rooms, and now we're doing it in social media posts on walls and, people's spaces and things like that. All right, so back to this. Another example from Frankfort, Kentucky, this time in the Frankfort Roundabout, June 16th, 1894. An elephant was to swim the Kentucky River, and the Frankfurters were anxious to see how the specimen of the pachyderm tribe would perform the aquatic feat. Judge Nuttall was among the number who wanted to see it, and he announced that the court would adjourn for that purpose. There was an important case in court, and the proposition was objected to, but the judge was inflexible and, heedless of all protestation, adjourned the court to see the elephant swim the river. So they say.
That's hilarious to me.
Yes. And this is from a response to that where they say, there's no they say business about Judge Nuttall adjourning the court in this city so that he could go down and see the elephant swim the river, but it's an actual fact. He gave as a reason that he was an old man and might not have another opportunity of witnessing such a sight. Therefore, he did not care to miss it.
I mean, like, part of me is like, good for you, Judge. Like,
yeah, they wanted to keep, doling out justice, but the judge was all like, there's an elephant. And, the phrase, see the elephant? I want to see the elephant. Literally, though. So
awesome.
We're going to adjourn so I can go see this. And we see it again. Maybe the last time that I saw it in print was 1907 in the Idaho Republican out of Blackfoot, Idaho. This was the August 16th edition. Mr. and Mrs. Wilkel went to Idaho Falls on Thursday of last week to see the elephant. Another example of a status update that was posted in a newspaper. They really start to fall out of favor in written communications in the early 1920s. Today, the only place we really see the phrase now is when speaking of seeing combat, and even that's relatively rare, but it is still used in some military circles.
Gotcha.
Okay, moving on now. Chris Moscato, a professor of history at the University of Northern Colorado, writes of soldiers during the Civil War. They had to be fit as a fiddle at all times, in good shape, because they never knew when they would see the elephant or witness battle. So we talked about seeing the elephant, but now I want to transition to fit as a fiddle.
Okay.
So fit as a fiddle, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, means in good form or condition. And the OED shows it being first attested in the early 1600s. so similar phrases at the same time, including fine as a farthing fiddle and fine as a fiddle. But even though the phrase was around beforehand, it was such a common term heard during the Civil War that we'd be remiss not to talk about it here. And in the book Great Civil War Projects You Can Build Yourself by Maxine Anderson, she writes, Know Your Civil War Slang. This is one of those little pop-out boxes, outside of the print.
Right.
So she's got stuff that she's writing about. And then there's just this little thing on the side because she used a phrase. And she said, Know your Civil War slang. Fit as a fiddle, meaning in good shape, healthy, feeling good. We also see it defined in Life in Civil War America by Michael Varolha. Fit as a fiddle, in good shape. So another interesting fact from that same book, though, is a statement on the phrase war is hell. This is what Michael Varolha writes. So, too, many words we use to describe the events of the Civil War have their origins in the years following the conflict. For example, Union Major General William Tecumseh Sherman is widely known as having stated war is hell. However, he did not say this until 1879, some 14 years after the war had ended.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I've heard that war is hell, came from the Civil War, but it just came from a Civil War general who said it after the Civil War.
Gotcha. That's kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean,
Right. Same with the phrase, live free or die, for death is not the worst of evils.
Mm-hmm.
That's Major General John Stark, and I am a direct relation of. But
Very
anyway,
cool.
so John Stark had wrote that actually he couldn't attend a gathering of his soldiers. This was far after the Revolutionary War. It's oftentimes attested to being a civil or a Revolutionary War phrase, but it is not. And it was in a letter that he wrote to his troops because he was too ill and convalescent to be able to attend a reunion party with them. So he wrote a letter, and it was in that letter where he wrote that phrase, live free or die, for death is not the worst of evils.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. All right, so even the Gettysburg Military Park and the National Park Service get in the action with their booklet, The Life of a Civil War Soldier, which is a student field program. In fact, we have a copy of it here. They have a Civil War slang section in the booklet, which has numerous common phrases at the time, including fit as a fiddle, defined as in good shape or healthy.
Cool.
So these are just a few examples of fit as a fiddle being used during the Civil War. We've already done this phrase once, so I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but because it was used so often during the Civil War, I definitely wanted to include a couple of other things I found specific to that.
Yeah, it's nice to highlight those.
I'm going to read a little piece from a paper by Jay Monaghan called Civil War Slang and Humor, written in 1957, and I quoted this earlier as well, but here's another section. A great many of the slang expressions of 100 years ago have changed a little, but are still recognizable. Thus, when a modern soldier says liquidate, a Civil War veteran would have said salivate. To squeal on a companion was called blowing on him. That's not what that means now. The Civil War expression to run against the stump is more commonly worded today as to run against a snag. In a like manner, a studious cadet at West Point in the 1850s was called a dig instead of the more modern grind. The grapevine, as understood in Civil War days, has survived, although the latter-day servicemen prefer latrine humor or scuttlebutt.
Ah, yeah.
And here's a note from Chris Moscato at the University of Northern Colorado. I imagine that you're in an army camp. People are shouting for various objects, and often they'll use slang terms to describe daily items. A soldier looking for bark juice is hunting for liquor, maybe to wash down those sheet iron crackers, the hardtack soldiers ate. After all, a cup of Rio, coffee, would be scarce as hen's teeth when rations were low. Other soldiers might be preparing for battle, filling the beehive, which is their knapsack, with hornets, bullets. Be careful if someone mentions having an Arkansas toothpick, however, that's just a really big knife. And that person might be loaded for bear, meaning armed to the teeth, and ready to pick a fight. And I will put this here just as a side note, the sheet iron crackers, right? So a note about the hardtack. The Gettysburg National Battlefield Museum has an actual piece of hardtack on display from the battle in 1863. So it was picked up shortly after the battle and had been preserved. And there were a lot of places in Gettysburg because the whole town was involved in the battle. But there are a lot of places that people were using as kind of like tourist things. And so this had been shown off and was eventually donated to the museum. So there's no mold on it. There's no evidence of degradation. It's like Twinkies for the Civil War era.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
You.
It'll last forever and it'll give you calories, I guess. But I'll pass. I'm gonna put a picture on the Patreon so you can take a look at it. But it's very interesting. I can totally see why they call them sheet iron crackers too, because if they are as hard as they look, I mean, it's in the name, hardtack.
Yeah.
So. Well, I love phrases that come out of wars because there tends to be a mixing of many different backgrounds and dialects. And these are, from people spending time together, people that would have never spent time together on their own, but now they're all thrust into a common situation. And that leads to a lot of melding of languages.
Yeah.
But despite the language changes that happened during times of war, we have to remember that those men and women, language was the least of their thoughts. The American Civil War was the deadliest war in American history, with various accounts, but 620 to 720,000 deaths. And that's just shy of all the deaths in all the other wars America's ever fought in combined. Slavery was at the heart of the war, and as a result of the war, slavery was outlawed in the United States. Brothers killed brothers, fathers killed sons. It was not a pretty picture. But it is part of the American history. We must remember that whenever a powerful group tries to take away basic dignity from another group of humans, there are still other humans that will fight for those rights. And if we don't stand up to protect those kind of human rights during times of peace, it will inevitably lead to violence. Well, that about wraps us up for today. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to find us on your favorite podcasting app and leave a review. If you have a suggestion for an idiom or another turn of phrase, or you just want to chat, you can catch us on social media, mostly on Twitter @BunnyTrailsPod, or on Patreon at patreon.com/BunnyTrailsPod. Of course, you can get links to everything we do at BunnyTrailsPod.com.
If you've enjoyed this episode, you might check out another podcast that talks about history, Cutting Class Podcast. It's a history podcast and a comedy podcast, so a history comedy podcast told by two high school teachers. Every Wednesday, they bring you funny, amazing, unbelievable stories from the past to amuse and delight you for absolutely free. And if you don't like it, they'll give you your money back, guaranteed. Actually, I really like those guys. They're awesome. Check them out at cuttingclasspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week. And until then, remember, words belong to their users. Dan has a cold this week, which is why his voice is ridiculously deep.